So in this lecture, I wanted to talk about JPEG versus RAW, about image quality with JPEG and RAW, what the SRAW, MRAW, CRAW mean, and the new dual pixel RAW, and of course the standard DNG file, which was created by Adobe. I also want to briefly cover bit depth so you understand the relationship of how bit depth directly affects your image processing, and how JPEG and RAW work in combination with that bit depth. So let's do a super quick review, make sure everybody's on the exact same page. We all know photography is about capturing light. In fact, the etymology of the word photograph is basically light drawing. Now, to make a photograph, we use a camera. A camera is a light tight box. We have to control both the amount of light that is exposed to the digital sensor and also control the sensitivity of that sensor surface to light. We control the light that comes into the camera with the exposure triangle. The exposure triangle comprises the aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. These three camera and lens controls work together to regulate the amount of light that makes it to the light sensitive surface, aperture and shutter speed, and the sensitivity of that surface, ISO. As you know, aperture controls depth of field, which is the range of acceptable focus, whether one thing's in focus or everything's in focus. Shutter speed can blur or freeze action, and ISO can add or lessen digital noise in an image while increasing or decreasing the sensor's sensitivity to light. And I have a whole other video on this. So imagine you're looking at this scene through your camera. Whether you're using an iPhone, a point and shoot camera, a mirrorless camera, or DSLR, when you tap the shutter release button on your camera, light passes through a series of optics that is controlled by those three factors of the exposure triangle and lands on the digital sensor where it is captured on that sensor. This is what your sensor captures. I use black and white for a reason. Digital sensors are totally colorblind. Your digital sensor absorbs light and turns it into numbers with an analog to digital converter process. The more light it sees, the higher the number. Now, for simplicity's sake, imagine this is a 12-bit RAW file with 4096 levels of gray. Now understand, I'm just representing this concept in a common sense way. The actual numbers indicating the brightness would be really, really different since they're based on bits and bit depth and computer language of zeros and ones. But this gives a good representation of what I mean. 8 out of 4096 is going to be very close to pure black, which is 0. And then the 3952 is very close to the 4096. So obviously it's a super bright light tone, probably one of the brightest tones in this image. So looking at the scene, and let me just take this little square part of the boat hull. Remember, it's just capturing those pixels. Those pixels are being converted to black and white values from the full tonal range from black to white and all the grays in between, which are then converted into numbers that the computer in your camera can understand. Now, this mosaic pattern is called a Bayer pattern, and it's named after its inventor, Bruce Bayer. And essentially, you can also call this a color filter array. And with this color filter in place, our camera sensor now sees a grid of alternating colors. This happened back in 1976 when an engineer at Kodak created this, and it's named after him because his last name was Bayer. Now, this color filter array is the most common configuration over all digital cameras. I think Fuji is the only one that doesn't use this one. They use something called Foveon. Now, there are twice as many green filters as the red or blue ones. Do you notice that? In every grouping of 4, there's always 2 green ones. That's because the human eye is more sensitive to green light, so the sensors were built to mimic our human eyes. So that light input that enters the lens, it's going to hit the sensor, and physicists refer to light as photons, and photographers just call it light. Now, as a quanta of light, photons are the smallest possible packets of electromagnetic energy. They strike the sensor's pixel sites where they are converted to electrons proportional to the amount of light hitting the pixels. A 24 megapixel camera would have 24 million pixel sites because a megapixel is 1 million pixels. But remember, that light is also going through the color filter array, that Bayer pattern. The camera figures out the real colors by going over every pixel, looking at its neighbors, and kind of guessing the 2 missing colors. This crucial step is known as demosaicing or debayering. Now let's go back to this process. Where does demosaicing fit in? Remember, the pixels capture light and are registered in red on the XY basis, so all the way across here and down. The signal goes through some noise removal steps, and there is a charge to voltage conversion and then an ISO gain adjustment depending on where you set your ISO. But then it goes to the analog to digital conversion process. This is where all the pixel sites are measured based on the light that hit them from the analog, the real world subject, and here it's converted to digital numbers as filtered through that colorful Bayer pattern. The demosaicing process can happen right here in the analog to digital conversion, or it can have a whole nother step built in. Just remember, the demosaicing is when the camera figures out the real colors by going over every pixel, looking at its neighbors, and guessing the two missing colors. And at that point, the image or output is an RGB JPEG file that's 8-bit and everything's baked into it, or it's output as a RAW file, maybe 12-bit or 14-bit, where all the data is encoded into the image. Nothing is thrown away. And from either place, it's stored on the memory card, giving you this image as either a JPEG file or RAW file or both. Let's go further into JPEG versus RAW. What is a JPEG file? So a JPEG file, which stands for Joint Photographic Experts Group, is a lossy raster file format that compresses an image to make the file smaller. JPEG files are some of the most popular and widely used image formats in the world. Photographers can shoot in JPEG mode, while graphic designers and illustrators and other creatives can edit them and work on them. Well, then what is a RAW file? A RAW file contains all the uncompressed and unprocessed image data captured by the sensors of the digital camera. They're also a type of raster file format, but one that maintains lossless quality. That means no image data is lost due to compression. RAW files are not images. They're just large files filled with the image data that was captured. That's why you need a third-party software to read the RAW files. All right, let's really drill down on the JPEG. The first part is you just capture the original data. Now, in step 2, there's going to be a lot of in-camera processing. So if I'm taking a photograph of this image, essentially the color space, the white balance, the sharpening, the saturation, the contrast, the noise reduction, and a ton of other things are being baked into the image, and then it's going to be compressed. If these 5 pixels are side by side from a little tiny part of this rose, remember there's 24 million pixels making up this rose image, but here's 5. Compression is going to start averaging out the colors so you get less color variation. And the more compression you have, the less color variation you're going to have in your image. And this is where the data loss occurs because the camera is literally averaging colors and brightness and is throwing away a ton of information so it doesn't have to store them individually. Now, that captured JPEG image is just stored as however your camera does it, 0001 point JPEG. Like it has its own naming convention, which is why it's always so important to rename your files. So let's talk about RAW. So the first thing you're going to do is press shutter release and you're going to capture the data, right? It's going to go through some in-camera processing, but it's only going to apply the RAW converter and record the white balance as a temporary file. And then it's going to do 0 compression as it stores that captured image onto your memory card. So you're going to have the rows information on your camera. And it's a RAW file. That means every camera has its own proprietary formula for how they interpret RAW files. So regardless of the camera you have, RAW files can only be read by the proprietary software that comes with the camera, or there's some other softwares you can use. If you have a Canon camera, you can download the Canon Digital Photo Professional for free. If you have a Nikon camera, you can download the Capture NXD software for free. And again, if you have a Fuji, Pentax, Sony, Leica, or any other kind of camera, they all come with proprietary software. Now, aside from that proprietary software, you can buy external third-party software. Capture One Pro is a really popular industry-used software, especially in commercial photography, product photography, that kind of thing. Lightroom has a RAW processing engine in it, so it can accept RAW files. Photoshop can accept RAW files. And again, with Lightroom and Photoshop, you get Adobe Camera Raw, which can also access and process RAW files. Now notice the proprietary formats. You'll get used to seeing them. So .cr2 or .cr3 is a Canon, .nef is a Nikon, Pentax is .pef. You kind of get the idea. So that's how you know it's a RAW file and not a JPEG because it doesn't say JPG. So in case you're asking yourself, there really isn't a sort of a universal file format called RAW. RAW is a type of file, And each camera, again, has its own way of bundling that data that it receives from the image sensor when you take the picture and creating its own proprietary file. All of these are raw files. Now, right away, you can see the issue with this in that these files are not easily shareable without some kind of a third party software to interpret them. In addition, these files are huge, typically 4 to 5 times the size of JPEGs, even though they were captured with the exact same size sensor. So, why does nearly every professional photographer shoot in RAW? They're simply superior files. Whereas JPEGs discard data in order to create a smaller file size, RAW files preserve all of that data. It throws away nothing. That means you keep all the color and luminance data and you preserve everything you can in regards to maintaining your highlight and shadow detail, which gives you a lot of options in post production. So, again, image quality is the same in every camera. In this Canon camera, it's the first option and it's the first item in the first option. So, you're just going to select the image recording quality. It's going to give you some kind of a dialog box that looks like this. And currently, I have large, fine JPEG selected because essentially, if it doesn't say RAW, it's JPEG. So, that S2 and S3, that's JPEG. It's super small JPEGs. You get an indicator of how big your file is going to be. So I'm using my full sensor, 24 megs, which is going to capture a 6,000 pixel by 4,000 pixel image with fine rendering. And based on the card I have in my camera, it's telling me I can take 703 shots with this setting. And this is where you set the image recording quality. Now I wanted to pop over real quick to Nikon and Sony. Obviously, every camera has a similar way of adjusting your image quality. Just like a car always has the gas pedal on the right, the steering wheel is always directly in front of you. In every menu of every camera, whether it costs $100 or $10,000, you're going to have some image quality adjustments. And it's going to be very clear whether you're choosing a RAW, a JPEG, a RAW plus a JPEG, etc. Popping back over to this, are you wondering what that is? Like what these really mean? So, what's the difference between the fine JPEG and the standard JPEG? This one is the fine, this one is the standard. You see, these settings indicate the different levels of image quality caused by different compression rates. Now, this first smooth setting produces a higher quality. The second one produces a slightly lower image quality with less pixels, and this allows more images to be saved on the card. So a RAW file is the best quality size ratio storage a photograph can use to store pictures, mainly because each primary color, RG or B, is recorded in 12 or 14 bits and a lossless compression is used. JPEG files are the opposite. They're ready to use files. They're only 8 bits for JPEG and they do use lossy compression, which means they throw away image data to make them smaller. Now, the camera embedded software processes the image data and it bakes in all the saturation settings, sharpness, white balance, contrast, noise reduction, among other things, making it harder to change later in post production. But they're very easy to use and they take no post processing to be able to view them. This kind of grid is going to be in every camera manual that you can download for free. Just Google your camera and the word manual, and you can download the PDF and find this exact same file for your specific camera. For this camera, which has a 24 meg sensor, it's telling me that if I set my setting at large fine, my compressed file stored on the memory card is going to be 7.5 megabytes. If I use that standard quality, it's going to be half that. And notice the difference in shots I can get based on an 8 gig card. And then there's always some kind of cache or maximum burst rate that says how many pictures you can take before your camera quits taking pictures because it's so busy processing the files. So if you go all the way down to RAW, look all the way across, it's still 24 meg, but notice the file size that's being stored on your memory card. Even though it's still captured as a 24 meg file, the actual file is 30 megs because it's not compressed and no image data has been thrown away. Shooting in RAW, you can only get 230 shots with an 8 gig card. But if I shot in JPEG, I could get 940. You see how there's a difference there. Now, what about RAW plus JPEG? Like if you're hearing that RAW is really great and the best file, but you only know how to use JPEG, well then shouldn't you just shoot JPEG and RAW all the time? So RAW plus JPEG. It records a RAW image and a JPEG image with a single click of the shutter. The two separate images, which are saved as two separate image formats, are saved to the card simultaneously. The two images will be saved in the same folder with the same file numbers, file extension .jpg for JPEG and .cr2 or .cr3 if it's a Canon camera for RAW. And here's what it looks like. You click the shutter, it captures 2 images, it saves them on a folder on your memory card that looks just like this. What is RAW, MRAW, and SRAW, and CRAW? So here you see the medium RAW and SRAW, they don't compress them, they just capture a smaller image size. So if this was a 24 meg camera, the medium RAW would capture a 12 megapixel image instead of a 24 megapixel image. And the SRAW would capture like a 6 megapixel image. So if you're asking yourself, why would I have such an expensive camera, but I'm only going to use it to capture those small images? Well, here's an example of the way I use it. Like, let's say I'm doing a time lapse capture where I've set my camera on a tripod and I've toggled it to take one picture every 1 minute, and I'm going to let it do that for 2 hours. Or maybe it's set to take a picture every 10 seconds for 15 minutes, because essentially I want to stitch all these images together and make a time lapse movie. I don't need a giant 24 meg file to make a full HD image. A full HD image is pretty small, so I don't need all that image data clogging everything up for this purpose. So I would set mine to SRAW so that I have all the editability of the RAW processing engine, capturing a wider dynamic range, allowing me a lot of customization in post-production. And remember, in RAW, what you're going to learn during this sequence of RAW videos of how you can basically adjust one image to perfection, and then every shot you took in the same lighting and circumstances, whether you're doing night photography in one location or you're shooting a wedding reception all indoors, you can adjust all the core things like white balance and sharpness and brightness and exposure, and you can apply them to every single image with just the click of a mouse. Again, you're going to learn how to do that. Then what about CRAW? CRAW is a newer version of RAW where it's not changing the actual file size captured. It looks like this camera is a 20 meg capture camera based on the JPEG setting there. So that means it's going to capture a 20 meg RAW file, and then when it stores it, it's going to store as a higher size file, right? But a compressed RAW file uses a lossless compression method so that you can still capture that 20 meg file, but it's going to store on your memory card as half the size, which is really nice. There's been a lot of comparisons online between RAW and compressed RAW, side-by-side comparisons, and you really cannot tell an image quality difference even when you zoom way in. So let's just touch on bit depth. What is bit depth? Before we compare JPEG versus RAW, let's first discuss what bit depth means. A bit is a computer's way of storing information as either a 1 or 0. A single bit isn't good for anything beyond yes or no because it can only have 2 values. If it was a pixel, it would be pure black or pure white, and that's not very useful. So let's go deeper. To describe something complex, we combine multiple bits. Every time we add another bit, the number of potential combinations doubles. A single bit has 2 possible values, 0 or 1. When you combine 2 bits, then you can have 4 possible values. But it's not 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. It's 0, 0, 0, 1, 1, 0, and 1, 1. When you combine 3 bits, you can have 8 possible values. 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, 0, 1, 1. You kind of get the idea. Now, in general, the number of possible choices is 2 raised to the number of bits. So an 8-bit image is 2 to the 8th power, which essentially, remembering your math, 2 times 2 times 2, and do that for 8 times, you're going to get 256 possible integer values. Coincidentally, that's what a JPEG file is. A JPEG file is an 8-bit image that captures 256 possible luminance values for each the RGB channel. Now in Photoshop, this is represented as integers 0 through 255 because 0 is counted as a number, and that's how it represents all 256 possible integer values. Now internally, this binary code would range from all these zeros to all these ones in the computer. But we don't need to go any more technical than that. Now, if your digital camera can record RAW files, you can take advantage of higher bit depths when you edit your images. Bit depth refers to the number of colors that can be displayed by a digital device. The higher the bit depth, the more colors and luminance used in the image, and consequently, the larger the file size. Now, JPEG images are always recorded with 8-bit depth. This means the files can record 256 levels of luminance in each of the red, green, and blue color channels. RAW cameras that support RAW file capture offer higher bit depths, usually ranging from 12 to 16 bits. If you have a really old camera, your RAW file may be 10 bits. Now, a 12-bit, pretty much every camera today captures in 12-bit RAW. And a 12-bit image file can record 4096 levels of each of the 3 color channels, while a 16-bit image can cover over 65,000 discrete levels of red, green, and blue information. So here's just a quick visual of bit depth. So 1 bit we talked about is black to white. Now here's a quick table just showing you the different bit depths and the number of tones that are captured in each of the RGB channels. But the ones that I think is important for you to know as a photographer, designer, and illustrator is that an 8-bit image captures 256 tones in each of their RGB channel. This is a JPEG file. 12 and 14-bit RAW files capture huge amounts of tones in each of the RGB channels. And I want you to know that a 12-bit file captures 4096 tones, and a 14-bit RAW file captures over 16,000 tones. And then I'm going to just jump ahead to the 32-bit, which is insanity, right? How many tones is that? Did you do the math? Yeah, that's actually 4 billion tones, 4.3 billion tones in each RGB channel. And you can only get this from merged HDR images. That's where you take multiple images and you compress them all together in one image. It's like taking the image data from a lot of different images and crushing it and squishing it all into one image, allowing a total range of image luminance capture from the brightest brights to the darkest darks. Now let's talk about how histograms and bit depth sort of relate to each other. You already know how histograms work and how they give you an indication of underexposure, correct exposure, and overexposure. And if this is a histogram, you know that from top to bottom is just indicating how many pixels of a certain tone is there. Right here, 0 is pure black. And so here's a graph showing you pure black. So everything up here is pure black. And there are no pure blacks. There actually are not very many dark tones at all here. If you're missing black, or you're missing white, which we're missing pure white over here too, or if you're missing both, this is a flat image, and we would have to adjust the contrast. But that's in another lecture. This is an 8-bit file. It's capturing 256 tones from pure black at 0 to pure white at 255. And that's kind of how the histogram is spread out. The darkest tones are on the left, the lightest tones are on the right. That 0 all the way to 255, that is your 8-bit image that gives you those 256 tones of brightness in each RGB color channel. But what most people don't know is how your camera is using these bits. It's not proportional. Like in these 5 categories, it's not dividing 256 by 5. It's disproportionately using up your tones of brightness. And whether you're shooting JPEG or RAW, the first half of your brightness tones are captured in the lightest tones of your image. And then it goes down to 64 and then to 32. This is one of the reasons when you underexpose an image and you're capturing everything in the darker areas, the pixels aren't equally spread out. And that's why you usually get a ton of noise and banding and posterization whenever you try to brighten up a really underexposed image. Now let's look at 12-bit RAW, where you get 4096 tones of brightness. That phenomenon is still happening, where 2048, half of your 4096 is being used only for the lightest tones in the image, and then it kind of goes by half all the way down. But in actuality, the way it's spread, I mean, I've shown you the histogram, and the normal thing you see similar in Adobe Camera Raw. Actually, the midtones are usually really wide, and then the lightest and the light tones are usually very narrow. Same for the dark and the darkest tones. This scale here at the bottom, this is actually a more accurate representation of what it's doing. So this diagram shows you how the linear response of a digital sensor maps to the number of EV you can potentially capture. Now notice how the brightest stop of light takes up half the available values of your RAW file. So this is a camera that's able to capture a 12-stop exposure value, which means a 12-stop dynamic range. Remember, our eyes can see about 30, and depending on how much money you spend on your camera will depend on how big the brightness range of your camera will capture. Those inexpensive point and shoots that are 100 to 200 bucks, I mean, you might be capturing 4 to 6 levels of brightness range. And then as you spend in the consumer cameras that are like 500, 600 bucks, you're probably capturing 8 to 10. As you spend more money, you can capture 12 to 20 stops of dynamic range. So this camera captures 12, and what it's showing you is the very brightest tones on the far right. That one EV value, that one stop, is using up half your tones. And then the next stop, which is not the lightest colors, but light colors, is using up the other half. And do you see how it's really a progressive linear tone rate usage? That's just something to think about. And that's why you hear the idea of always exposed to the right. Basically, shift all your exposures by looking at your histogram. Make sure you're shifting them towards the right side of the histogram, but not running up against the wall, because if you run up against the wall, you're going to clip the highlights, which means you only have paper white that can never be returned. We can't talk about RAW without talking about DNG. So what is DNG? DNG stands for a digital negative image. DNG is an open source, royalty-free, highly compatible, and continuously improving raw image format that was built by Adobe for editing photos. And obviously it works great with Adobe software. So let's go back. What is a RAW file? RAW files are raw, untouched, and unprocessed images recorded directly from your camera sensor. No information is thrown away. All available image data is there, with no information cut, added, or compressed. This leads to high quality images that you can edit with minimal quality loss. Then what's the difference between a DNG and a RAW file? There are several important differences between the two file types, especially in how you edit and store them. You see, DNGs are easier to edit. Editing a RAW file can be a challenge. You'll need to use a sidecar or convert them to other formats first in some third-party software. And a sidecar is a separate XMP file that contains all the edits, changes, and settings. So these are the images I have. They're various RAW files from various cameras. And I'm looking at these in Bridge. And essentially, every time you edit a RAW file, the original file remains completely untouched and unchanged. And then the sidecars are small files, but they also mean that every RAW file is stored as two files. But notice you don't see the XMP files. Look right here. So I've got 32 images showing, but I've got 40 other files that have been hidden. That's because those XMP files are always hidden from you whenever you use any Adobe products, because they know there's nothing you can do with them. They can only be used by the software, so they don't clutter up your hard drive. However, if you're a person that isn't using Adobe Bridge or Lightroom to manage your system, and you're using your Finder, you're going to see stuff like this. Because remember, every time you make an adjustment to a RAW file, it's going to store it as an XMP. Do you see all these XMPs? That's why those 30 images have 40 additional sidecar files. When I was younger, it's more accurate. Before I understood this, and we're talking over a decade ago, I didn't understand what these files were, so I just went and selected them all and deleted them. So that means I deleted all my RAW processing work. Don't ever do that. That was horrible. Learn from my mistakes. But you do see that they're very small. These 7 XMP files all together are only 110 kilobytes. I mean, crazy small. So why do photographers shoot in RAW? RAW files contain the greatest amount of information possible. For example, again, JPEG files only capture 256 levels of brightness in each RGB color channel. 12-bit can capture 4096 levels of brightness in each RGB color channel. And if you have a more advanced and newer camera, your 14-bit RAW files captures more than 16,000 levels. More levels of brightness means smoother transitions and fuller and richer images that are more detailed and less likely to wash out or have noise. Should you shoot in RAW and save as a DNG file? That's what I do. This is a practical solution used by numerous photographers. Many programs will also let you convert to DNG as you import. That's the way I do it with Adobe Bridge, and you can also do the same with Lightroom. I would just download everything and have it immediately converted to DNG. You lose no information. And the reason DNG is so great is it's like a PDF created by Adobe, the same people, and it's free, it's open source. It means it's never going to go away. So if you're investing in some small camera company like Fuji in the scheme of things, and it were to go bankrupt in 10 years and they then no longer support their RAW file, the software you have becomes outdated based on the upgraded operating system. Essentially, photographers are worried they're not going to be able to go back and access their RAW image data because the company's bankrupt. But as a DNG file, which is open source, that software is going to forever be there. So let's talk about DNG. The Adobe DNG converter enables you to easily convert camera-specific RAW files from supported cameras to a more universal DNG RAW format. Another benefit of using the DNG converter is backward compatibility. Now, here's something to think about. If you're using your camera's raw processing power, it's going to process the file, but keeping it its native raw format. Converting it to DNG makes it a universal raw file. And you can use your individual raw files or DNG files in any Adobe product. And you can actually convert your raw files to DNG when you're importing them using the Get Images function inside of Adobe Bridge. And if you're not downloading your images like that, well, watch my videos, learn how to do it because there's so much better than just putting a memory card in a computer and dragging it to a folder. It gives you more control, embeds copyright. There's just so much more you can do. But let's say you're not going to be a pro photographer and you're not actually even using Photoshop or Lightroom. You're using some third party, smaller consumer program like maybe Affinity, or you're using the free GIMP software, or maybe you're using photop.com, which is a free online browser software. Adobe will let you download this Adobe Digital Negative Converter software for free so that you can just plug in your memory card, open the software, select the files, convert it, save it to your local drive, and then you can use them. Here it's saying use them in Lightroom or Photoshop. Here's the link, which obviously is not going to link in a video, but you can obviously capture this, type it in, you'll figure it out. So it comes for both Mac and Windows. This gives you an idea of the kind of processor and operating system you should have. This will be forever changing and upgrading. Now, I wanted to talk just super briefly about this newest thing that's come out, the dual pixel RAW. And what does it mean? Well, this technology makes both focusing and image shooting possible with the same sensor. So the focusing is actually happening on the sensor as well as taking the pictures, capturing the images. So what happens is during dual pixel RAW shooting, a single RAW file saves two images into the file. One image consists of A and B combined image data, and the other is only the A image data. So what does this mean? Well, in dual pixel RAW mode, found in the newer Canon mirrorless cameras, it allows photographers to perform incredible adjustments to the images after they've shot them. This happens because these cameras capture two shots with each picture, and it creates a depth map, which can be embedded in the RAW file. This means that subtle adjustments to focus, bokeh, lighting can be made in the camera as well as in post-production software. And all of this is based on 3D data and depth maps. This is very much like the HEIF format on iPhones that allows that portrait focusing mode. Because remember, you're only getting shallow depth of field by software, not lens optics. So looking at the eyeballs here, the person shot the image on the left, missed the critical point of focus on the eye, and that's what this kind of dual pixel RAW allows. It allows you to shift that focus to the eye. Now, currently, these are micro adjustments you're allowed to make. Like you can't miss the person entirely, make the entire person back in focus. This is like making from the eyelashes to the pupil in focus or something. So what else can you do? Well, this new in-camera function changes the appearance of lighting on the faces and the subjects of your portraits. The appearance of the intensity spread and the direction of light can be altered in post-processing as well, enabling shadows to be lightened or darkened and repositioned, simulating the effect of a reflector. And again, this is very much like the new software compatibilities that you have in today's mobile phones, iPhones. You can also in camera apply clarity enhancement selectively to a photograph's background in the camera raw edit menu, which is great for landscape photography when there's a need to cut through the haze in the distance, making the background clearer to see. Again, these are really innovative new directions, taking kind of some of the most interesting features from mobile phone photography and putting it in professional high-end DSLRs and mirrorless cameras. After all of that, what do I recommend you do? If you've never shot RAW, ever, don't do it now. Continue shooting in JPEG for now. Master your exposure and your focus. Learn about the import protocols, the renaming protocols, and how the adjustments you can make in JPEG. As long as you're shooting well-exposed images, you don't need a lot of heavy-handed adjustment using all the data in a RAW file. The wedding photographers, for the most part, believe in using JPEG because they shoot maybe 10,000 images a wedding, and they're big believers in if you have your exposure and your white balance set appropriately, you shouldn't need massive adjustments that you can do with a RAW file. So they keep their image files smaller, they're ready to go, and it's just quicker. Professional commercial photographers or fine art photographers, people that want the most and ultimate control over their images, that aren't in a super high production mentality, they swear the merits of shooting in RAW. So again, if you're just starting out, shoot in JPEG for now. And when you feel like experimenting, go ahead and choose that JPEG plus RAW setting. Now, I only say that because in this time where you're learning, you'll see what your JPEG file comes with. And then when you get your RAW file, you'll be able to see what adjustments you can make, how much further you can push an image. But generally, don't always shoot in JPEG plus RAW. It wastes file size. You don't need to do it. Essentially, all I ever shoot nowadays is, and for the past decade, is just RAW. Just everything's RAW. So you'll figure out your way. JPEG's all you need to shoot for now. And then as you get more control or want more control, you can start experimenting with the JPEG plus RAW. And then eventually you'll have the courage to try to shoot just RAW. Well, I hope this has helped, and let's get busy with the processing part. Hey, if you like this video and it helped, you can help me. Smack it, whack it, and crack-a-lack it. Take care. I like subscribers.
That's awesome. Whoa. Yes! Oh my god, I did. This is...
Hey, you stayed to the end. You know what that means? You're awesome. I'm talking about you. Now get out of here.